The Ikhren moved differently when they crossed the threshold into the plaza. Sevhel had been watching them for weeks now, the three from the ship, the ones Asia called by a name he couldn't hold in his mouth, and he had learned to read the broad shapes of their bodies the way he read weather, the set of their triple-jointed legs when they were at ease, the angle of their crests when something had their attention, the slow, deliberate way the eldest moved through the corridors of the Arveth. Each step placed with the care of someone who had been walking on floors that did not belong to them for a very long time. He knew their shapes. He had stood watch over them, fought beside them in the corridor breakout, shared silence with them in the deep night watches when neither species had language for the hour. He did not understand them, but he knew what they looked like when they were carrying something. Now, as they stepped into the open air of the settlement plaza, the thing they had been carrying changed. Sevhel saw it in the eldest first, the way the old one's crest, which had been held at the careful neutral Sevhel had come to read as composed, lifted. It rose the way a sail fills when the wind finds it, a slow, inevitable expansion that had nothing to do with choice and everything to do with something arriving that could not be refused. The eldest stopped walking. The other two, the quiet one who traced symbols, and the third who had been declining and then recovering, stopped behind the eldest. The eldest is stopped, and the stopping was a statement in whatever language their bodies spoke, and it was a statement that demanded stillness. Sevhel leaned against the warm stone at the edge of the plaza, arms folded, and watched. The settlement's Ikhren were already there. He had seen them at a distance over the past 2 days. Figures with the same triple-jointed build, the same iridescent scales that shifted color in the planet's gold-green light, the same segmented kaleidoscope eyes, but more of them, perhaps 40, perhaps more. They had been going about the work of the settlement, tending the gardens with their impossible mathematical spacing, moving between buildings, interacting with the other settlement residents in ways Sevhel observed but could not parse. They were not cargo. They were not newly freed. They moved through this place the way a person moved through a home, without looking where they were going, because they already knew. When the eldest from the Arveth stopped, the settlement Ikhren stopped too, all of them. And he thought the simultaneous stillness of a flock wheeling in the air, everybody responding to the same invisible signal at the same instant. A woman carrying a vessel of water stopped mid-stride. A pair working in the nearest garden bed rose from their crouch in unison, their hands still dark with soil. The stillness spread across the plaza like frost over glass, and it was complete before Sevhel had finished drawing the breath he was holding. Sevhel had watched men come back from raids that went wrong and find their families waiting. He had watched the moment when someone who thought they might not return found out they did. He knew what reunion looked like. He was looking at it now, and he did not have a word for what the Ikhren were doing because he could not see all of it. The eldest raised one 6-fingered hand. A sound came from somewhere, from the eldest, from the settlement Ikhren, from the ground, from all of them at once. It was the sound the Ikhren representative had made in the plaza on the first day, when Pakla had watched the settlement respond. But that had been one voice. This was many, a layered resonance that began in the range Sevhel could hear, and then climbed or descended or both, passing through frequencies his ears could track, and then leaving them behind, becoming something he could not hear but could feel against the skin of his arms, the backs of his hands, the bone behind his ears. The quiet one from the Arveth, the one who had been declining, took a step forward, then another. The movement was slow, unsteady, the careful gait of someone who had been weak for a long time and was now being asked to carry something heavier than their own weight, the absence of a burden rather than the presence of one. Each step left a brief impression in the fine dust of the plaza stone, and the dust settled behind each footfall as if the ground itself were closing a record of the passage, a figure detached from the group of settlement Ikhren, smaller than the eldest, younger in some way. Sevhel read through posture rather than feature. This one moved toward the quiet one from the Arveth with a gait that was certain. It covered the distance of the plaza in strides that clicked against the stone, each triple-jointed leg extending fully for the first time Sevhel had seen. The Arveth corridors had never been wide enough for that. The stride was long and clean and unapologetic, the movement of someone who had been waiting and was finished waiting. They met in the center. Sevhel did not know what an Ikhren embrace looked like. He still did not know, because what happened next was no embrace he recognized. The two figures stood close, not touching, and their crests rose to full extension, iridescent scales shifting through colors Sevhel had no names for, and the sound that was not entirely sound intensified until the air in the plaza felt thick with it, felt textured, felt like standing in the shallows when the tide came in and the water wrapped around your ankles with a pressure that was gentle and absolute. The Twilight One's scales, which had been dull since the first day Sevhel had seen them, the pallor of someone who had been diminished, began to shift, slowly, like color returning to a face when the blood came back. The iridescence caught the gold-green light and threw it in patterns that moved across the stone around their feet, and Sevhel realized he was holding his breath. He let it out. In the center of the plaza, the eldest from the Arveth was surrounded now. Settlement Ikhren had moved to form a loose circle, no formation, no ritual arrangement. People who simply needed to be near. The eldest Crest was at full extension, the highest Sevhel had ever seen it, and the old one's body was producing a low, sustained vibration that Sevhel could feel through the stone he was leaning against. It traveled up through the wall and into his shoulder blades, settling there like the deep thrum of a ship's keel when the oars were working hard and the hull was singing with the effort. The third from the Arveth, the one Sevhel had mentally catalogued as the fighter, the one whose scales ran darker and whose posture had always carried the coiled readiness of someone expecting the next blow, stood slightly apart. Using the edge, Sevhel recognized the position because he was standing in the same one. The air changed when they all spoke at once. Sevhel had felt the edges of the Ikhren's third channel before, a quality of attention that he could not source, a change in the texture of a room that had no visible cause. On ship were 3 Ikhren in a corridor. It had been a whisper at the edge of perception, a thing he noticed and then could not confirm he had noticed. Now with 40 or more Ikhren in the same open space, all communicating on every channel they had, it was no whisper. Sevhel had no word for the scale because the sensation did not map onto sound. It was pressure, painless, directionless, the kind that changed the weight of the air itself, as if the space between his skin and the world had thickened into something almost tangible. It felt like the moment before a wave broke and then it released. All at once, a shift in the quality of being present in that plaza that made Sevhel's breath catch for the second time, and this time he did not let it out right away, because the release carried something with it. He could not decode it into words or images or anything his mind could hold in the shapes it used for knowing. A texture, an emotional weight that pressed against the walls of his chest like the bass note of a drum struck too close. He was noting it because it was real. He had no word for it in Norse or in any other language he had tried to use since the ship. He was a man who dealt in weight, in force, in the geometry of what a body could do against another body. This was none of those things, and it was as real as any of them. The Anena, the quiet one, the one who had been declining, was standing straighter now. Sevhel watched the change happen in real time, incremental and unmistakable. Something beyond strength was returning, a quality of presence that had been fading and was now being refilled, the way a stream that had run thin in dry seasons swelled when the rains finally came. The scales kept shifting color. The crest stayed high. The younger settlement Ikhren stayed close, not touching, radiating something on that third channel that made the air around them hum. Sevhel could not see most of what was happening. He understood this the way he understood deep water. You could see the surface, and you could feel what was underneath. But the seeing and the feeling were not the same sense, and they did not give you the same information. The surface was bodies in a plaza, crests raised, scales shifting. Underneath was something vast and layered and not for him. Both were true. He stayed at the edge, arms folded, back against warm stone, and let himself watch what he could watch. The gold-green light fell across the gathering and gilded every crest, every scale, every slow movement of hands that were not reaching for each other but were held open, palms turned slightly upward, as if cupping something invisible between them. The light made the colors richer. Sevhel watched the light do this and stored the image the way he stored the shape of a coastline, precisely because you never knew when precision about where you had been would be the thing that kept you alive. The thought found him in the quiet that followed. The Ikhren had not stopped communicating, the texture of the air still held that changed quality, and the gathering in the plaza had settled into a configuration that looked like it could sustain itself for hours. But the initial surge, the wave break, had passed, and what remained was gentler, a sustained resonance rather than a pulse. Sevhel could feel it the way he could feel a ship's hull vibrating around the heartbeat of its drive, present, constant, below the level of active attention. In the space that opened, the thought arrived. Uninvited, it walked in through the door that the reunion had unlocked, the door he had been standing in front of for weeks with his back braced against it, keeping it closed with the weight of work and watch and the focus required to survive each day aboard a stolen ship in unknown space. The Ikhren had found their people. He was not going to find his. The thought was not new. He had known it since the cell broke, since before the cell broke, since the moment the light took him from the Frankish shore and the weight of his body changed and the sky was replaced by metal. He had known it the way you know the water is cold before you go in, as a fact, not yet as a sensation. He had been too busy for the sensation. There had been doors to break and guards to fight and watches to keep and a ship to steal and a course to set and a planet to walk and a settlement to assess and Ikhren to guard and reunions to witness. Now there was a warm stone wall and gold-green light and a plaza full of people who had found each other, and the thought sat down beside him like an old companion and said, "Your brother is in the 9th century. He is doing the things a man in the 9th century does. You're not going back." Sevhel did not flinch from it. He was not the man who flinched from things. He looked at the thought the way he looked at a blade edge, directly, with respect for what it could do, without pretending it was something other than what it was. His brother was 32 years old, or had been, when the light took Sevhel from the shore. Bjorn was 32 and still surprised by his own laugh every time it came out of him, a great barking thing that shook his shoulders and made him look like a boy caught stealing from the larder, delighted and confused by his own delight. Sevhel had been at sea for 3 months at a time, and this was the thing he had looked forward to coming home to, the sound of his brother being surprised by joy. He was counting it carefully, because small things were what you actually lost. His nephew Bjorn's son Jin, the boy who had been learning to walk when Sevhel left for the Frankish coast, would be walking now, would have learned, would have fallen and stood the way all children did, and someone would have caught him when he fell, and it would not have been Sevhel. It would not be Sevhel. The boy would grow and learn to hold a tool and learn to hold a blade and learn the names of the winds and the names of the stars and the names of the things a man needed to know, and Sevhel would not be the one who taught him any of them. He put that on the list. One conversation he had not finished, with Bjorn, on the shore the morning before the raid. Bjorn had started to say something about the farm, about the land that needed clearing on the north side of the hill, and Sevhel had waved it off because the tide was right and the boats were loaded and there would be time when he came back. He could still see the shape of Bjorn's mouth holding the next word, the word Sevhel had not waited for. The morning light had been behind Bjorn's head and his hair had been the color of wet rope, and the word had stayed in his mouth, and Sevhel had turned toward the boats. There had not been time when he came back. There had been the light, and the metal, and the cell, and the wall that broke when his shoulder found the stress strain at the door mount. And then there had been all of this, and the conversation was still unfinished, and it would stay unfinished because Bjorn was in the 9th century saying the rest of it to empty air. He put that on the list. He was good at the raids, and they had been the work of his time, not his preference. A man did what his time required, and he had done it well, and he did not miss the act of violence or the weight of consequence that came with it. He did not grieve the cold, or the hunger, or the way winter settled into the bones on Orkney when the wind came off the North Atlantic and the walls of the longhouse earned their thickness. Those were the terms of life as he had known it, and life had different terms now, and a man adjusted, or a man died, and Sevhel was not a man who died. He was grieving his brother's laugh, his nephew's walk, one unfinished conversation about clearing land. 3 things. He held them in his chest like stones in a pouch, and he felt their weight, and he was precise about the counting because a man owed his losses that much. The light changed. The planet's sun, a shade more gold than the sun he remembered, slightly warmer, was settling toward the horizon. The shadows in the plaza lengthened. The Ikhren gathering had thinned somewhat, some of the settlement residents returning to buildings, but a core group remained around the Arvith's 3. The quiet one was sitting now, surrounded, scales still catching light in patterns that had not been there 2 days ago. The eldest stood near the center, crest partially lowered, in what Sevhel had come to read as contentment. Even the fighter had moved inward, not fully into the circle, but closer, drawn by the pull of something Sevhel could not name, but could observe. Sevhel had moved to the edge of the settlement proper, where the stone gave way to the natural ground of the planet. Dark soil, and short grass, and a line of trees that looked almost right, but belonged to no forest he knew. The bark was too smooth. The leaves caught the failing light and held it a beat too long before letting it pass through, so the canopy glowed faintly amber at the edges even as the trunks stood in shadow. The air smelled of growing things and warm stone and something faintly mineral, like the smell of a hot spring before you saw it. He sat on the ground with his back against the last wall and his face toward the open land, and he let the 3 stones sit in his chest, and he breathed. He heard her before he saw her. Not a sound she made. Sail moved without sound, or nearly without. In that way the settlement people moved. What he heard was the absence of sound, the insects or whatever passed for insects on this planet. The singing things in the grass went quiet in a radius that moved through the dusk toward him, a silent shape approaching. He tracked it by the edge of the quiet the way he would track a ship by its wake in fog, not the thing itself, but the mark it left on everything around it. She sat near him without asking. This was not the way a stranger sat. Sevhel noted it with the part of his mind that was always cataloging, always assessing the geometry of whoever was near him. She sat at the distance a companion would sit, not intimate, not formal, the distance of someone who had earned the right to share silence without requiring conversation to justify their presence. She had not earned that right. She sat as if she had. For a while neither of them spoke. The dusk deepened. The Ikhren resonance from the plaza was still present at the edge of Sevhel's perception, a sustained hum in the air that he had stopped trying to name. The gold moldlight of the sun pooled in the shadows between the trees and turned the grass the color of old bronze. A breeze came from somewhere, from the open land, carrying the smell of the trees and the mineral warmth of the soil, and it moved through the space between them without disturbing either of them. Sevhel. The word came in Norse, not the flat, approximate Norse he had heard from Ducka's consul when the translation system chewed on his language and spat out something that wore its clothes but didn't know its manners. This was Norse, his Norse Dendade, spoken with the stress patterns of a personal address, the tonal weight that said, I am speaking to a person I know, not a stranger, not a name on a list, not a word I learned. I know you. He looked at her. Sevhel was sitting with her hands resting on her knees, her face turned partly toward him and partly toward the failing light. She looked like a woman of perhaps 40 years. She had the features of no particular people Sevhel could name, no face he had seen before, just slightly elsewhere. The way the trees were off. The way the stream ran uphill for 4 meters and then remembered which direction water was supposed to go. She had said his name the way his mother had said his name. How, he said. One word. The question stripped to its root. The way you drove a blade into soil to see what was underneath. Sevhel did not answer the question. She said his name again. Sevhel. Different stress. Not the stress of I am addressing you. The stress of I have been holding this. The weight a word carried when it had been kept for a long time in care. The way his grandmother had said his grandfather's name after the old man died. Not as a summons, but as a record, a thing preserved against forgetting. She had been holding his name, not for the days since the Arveth landed. She had been holding it the way you held something you had been given and had promised to keep. Sevhel looked at her for a long moment. The dusk was deep enough now that the light was amber and the edges of things were soft. Behind them, in the plaza, the Ikhren were still communicating. The air still changed, still textured, still thick with whatever moved between them on channels he would never fully perceive. Ahead, the open ground ran toward the trees, and the trees ran toward the darkening sky, and the sky held stars that were not his stars, but were becoming familiar in the way that anything you looked at enough times became familiar, through repetition rather than belonging. He did not ask the question again. She had answered it, not the question he had spoken, but the one underneath. The answer was in the stress pattern of his name the second time. I have held this, which meant she had been holding it for a long time, which meant she had known it for a long time, which meant she had known him for a long time. In whatever way these people knew things, across time, across the gap between the 9th century and this gold-green planet in a star cluster the Combine would not enter. He had been known, across a distance he could not measure, by someone he had never met, for reasons he did not understand. His name had been held with care. This was not comfort, it was not relief. It was the discovery that a gap he had believed was absolute, the gap between the life he had and the life he was in now, had been bridged by someone standing on the other side, holding a rope he did not know existed. And I mean to, we be thinking and that feeling, he did not try to name it. He had learned, today, that some things did not have names in Norse or any other language he had access to, and this was one of them. The dust settled. The air cooled. The Ikhren resonance continued in the plaza behind them, patient and sustained. Somewhere in the trees something that might have been an owl made a low, liquid note that hung in the air and faded slowly, the way a stone dropped into still water sent rings outward long after the stone itself had disappeared. How many have come here before us? Sevhel said in Norse. The words felt strange in his mouth, not because they were difficult, but because he had not spoken Norse to someone who understood it since the cell. The language had been a private thing, an interior architecture, a way of thinking that he carried without sharing. Now it had a listener, and having a listener changed the weight of the words. They were heavier when someone else could hold them. Many, Sile said, Norse, clean and clear and carrying the weight of a word chosen because it was accurate, human, and some, Sevhel considered the horizon. The trees were dark shapes now, and the first stars were showing, wrong stars, in wrong patterns, but the act of looking up at the night and finding light there was the same act on any world. He had done it from the deck of every ship he had ever sailed. He had done it from the stone of Orkney, when the night was clear and the air was cold enough to make the stars sharpen into points that you could cut yourself on if you stared too long. The stars changed, the looking did not. Did they find what they were looking for? The pause that followed was long enough that the insects, or whatever they were, started singing again in the grass around them. One of them, close to Sevhel's left hand, made a sound that was almost like a cricket and almost not, a rising two-note call that repeated with the regularity of a heartbeat. Another answered it from further out. The same call shifted slightly lower, and the two of them traded the sound back and forth like men passing a flask on a cold watch. They found what was here, Sevhel said. That is not always the same thing. Sevhel considered this. The 3 stones in his chest, the laugh, the walk, the unfinished conversation were still there. They would always be there. He was not a man who set things down because they were heavy. He was a man who learned the weight and carried it accurately and did not pretend it was lighter than it was. No, he said, it is not. They sat until the light failed.